space between
Hello, folks.
Good.
Can you hear me well?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Good.
Thank you. So I think this is my room. Let me change my name here. Doesn't seem to want to let me change my name, but I'm gonna warn you guys. I don't know how informal this is gonna be. Sort of have a full length paper. I could break it up. I can pause and allow people to jump in if people want to flag stuff.
So you have, I guess, 15 minutes roughly speaking, about 5 minutes on either side, and then we'll have the general Q&A after. At least that's the format that is, generally goes for these types of things. I'm down for, if you want to change that, but you're muted.
That's, I guess, up to you and the people here. Like, I have a full presentation with slides and other things set up, but I can give a quick summary and chat if that's what people are in the mood for. That is the format, so I don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a presentation, we might as well do that then.
All right.
I'll keep time, and if you go for 15 minutes, I'll let you
know.
Oh,
it's way over 15 minutes. So
right.
if you want to do a shorter session, then that's what we'll do, and I'll just. All right. So my name is Leo Lapiano. I guess I'm an independent scholar, though I do have degrees from the University of Toronto in philosophy. My paper that I wrote for this is on really Leibniz's Theodicy, Voltaire's Candide, and Rousseau, as we get him passed through the revolutionaries as recorded by Thomas Carlyle and Albert Camus in The Rebel. And I chose these three texts first for contingent historical reasons. And that's because the concept optimism first appears in Leibniz's Theodicy, which is a 1711 text coming from the New Latin optimum, and his thesis that this is the best of all possible worlds. So this idea we could think of in terms of programming language and the optimal solution, i.e. that Leibniz understood the world to be the optimal solution to God's desire to create the best possible worlds. And so all the suffering, et cetera, that we experience has to be accounted for, explained away by the parameters that God had to allow in order to obtain his objective. So that's how the concept optimism enters our language. Although it expresses a bundle of interrelated ideas that comprise the very core of philosophy itself. We then get the apparent negation of optimism in the 1759 text Candide by Voltaire, which has the full title Candide or Optimism. The novel is a satire of many things, but including explicitly Leibniz's philosophical claim that this is the best of all possible worlds. And it's in response to this novel, Voltaire's Candide, that the Jesuit critics who read it come up with the term pessimism to account for Voltaire's philosophy. So the concepts come into being in these two works in the 18th century. Then I also talk about Rousseau, kind of a straw man of Rousseau, as we get him interpreted through the revolutionaries as recorded by Thomas Carlyle, the 19th century Scottish essayist, and Albert Camus in The Rebel. And this is also contingent, my choice to include this in the discussion based on the history of these two concepts. Because it's in December of 1794 that the term pessimism passes out of French, pessimisme, to English. And we have our first recorded instance in English. And it passes into English in a letter from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the Romantic poet, author of Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in a letter to his friend, the other poet, Robert Southey, and is used in the context of discussing two poems. One's about a moldering mansion, and the other is about a decaying farm. So it's about entropy, or the idea that things left to themselves will fall apart or get worse. And so Coleridge and Southey, both as Romantic poets and intellectuals in England, were watching the French Revolution very closely. And so they knew that in 1794, Coleridge would have known that 1794 was the year that the reign of terror finally turns on its on the revolutionary leadership themselves. So it's the year that Danton, Saint-Just, and Robespierre are executed. So writing in December of 1794 to his friend, Coleridge would have known how these revolutionary leaders had encountered their own darknesses at noon. In other words, having met the guillotine, having been convicted by their own logic. So these are the contingent historical particularizations of the concepts which make these texts so illuminating for, I think, an attempt to consider optimism in its place now. So a couple of the things I really wanted to bring out were that the Theodicy, which is I guess a rationalist masterpiece, maps the logical nexus in which optimism is nested. And Candide and Rousseau and the Terror demonstrate one possible path by which the encounter of these ideas are actualized. But this logical nexus is philosophical, so it's metaphysical, it's ontological, but it's also theological. And to me, that's really important, right? It's only recently in the modern period that theology has been really understood as something separate that can be held separate from metaphysics and ontology. And that's simply just not true for most of the history of philosophy. So when we want to talk about what's fundamentally an ontological thesis, to avoid theology is as Leibniz understood, impossible. So for him, the discussions about optimism are bound up with the question of dualism versus monotheism. That is the problem of evil. How do you explain evil if it's a truly monotheistic world? If God was a good, benevolent God, how come evil exists? And this is bound up with Thrasymachus's thesis that justice is simply what's in the interest of the strongest. For him, all of these things are connected to the true faith. And for him, the true faith is expressed in this idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds. But if Leibniz is correct, and I certainly don't have time to evaluate that right now, but if his ontology is correct, we still are left with our empirical reality of encountering suffering. And as you know, our ancient texts from the book of Job to the whole history of tragedy, rebellion make clear, the question is, even if it's correct, how do we actually believe it? You know, Job, Christ on the cross, all the tragic figures have moments of despair in the darkness that they encounter. So how is the true faith possible if it's effective and if it's what we should be aiming at? So this was I'm gonna now kind of repeat this dialectic, but at a different level, really quickly try and do that in, I guess, 5 minutes here. So next, I want to suggest that if we take Leibniz as the abstract calculus of metaphysics, an ontology of optimism, as a meditation, it draws us towards seemingly inescapable conclusions. That's what he's trying to do with his logic. But his rationalist approach clashes with the material of our experience, since we lack a definitive empirical proof. We can never have a definitive empirical proof. The geometric that he provides, for him, logic, geometry, and metaphysics are interchangeable. One seems incapable of explaining the friction of our daily life. And because the language in theory could be learned in isolation, when it encounters the real world, it suffers from this friction. So what happens when we attempt to hold on to this abstract conception of the logic? And to me, this is what Voltaire does in Candide. Superficially, he's pessimistic, satirizing Leibniz. The Jesuits call his philosophy pessimism. But what we really get is a comedic depiction of what happens when Candide, the main character, his belief in the ontology that this is the best of all possible worlds, encounters the real of his experience. Excuse me. When the best is still abstract for Candide, he's learned this intellectually as a young man living in a castle. Because he lacks phronesis or practical knowledge, an idea of what his own self-interest is, and so self-understanding, a self-awareness, the training that would teach him what is best for himself, what is his own interest. He lacks self-recognition, self-knowledge, but thinks he's in possession of the highest knowledge about God and the order of things. His folly is the result of him lacking any sense for how he or others fit into this order. So the negation that Voltaire offers is really a long series of events which make the concept concrete in ways that negate the abstract understanding. In the case of Candide, the tragic element contained in the comedic is that Candide has to suffer far too many horrible events, and it takes him far too long to learn, to acquire phronesis. And so by the time he learns, he's denied the capacity to partake in many of the joys that we would like to believe are possible if we're going to be optimists. So quickly to jump to, but the tragedy is minimized. It's redeemed as a comedy because Candide is not involved at the political level. And this is the main contrast with what we get in the negation and alternative that we get through Rousseau in the revolutionary leadership. There we get the French society. If we are going to straw man Rousseau a bit, as I do, admittedly, everywhere man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. So the natural state of man is freedom, and it's only a fallen state that arises through society. And specifically in the case of the French monarchy, it's a corruption, it's sectarianism, it's these factions that are distorting the general will. And as long as we get the general will in charge of making decisions, we're going to get a flawless path to the greatest good. We are going to end up at utopia. We will be in the best of all possible worlds if we just remove this corrupting influence. And so really what we get here is the attempt to folly, a similar folly as Candide, and it is an attempt to apply these abstract concepts of liberty, fraternity, equality in a way politically without the people who are trying to apply them actually having phronesis. They're incapable of recognizing their own self-interest. And when they go to apply it at a political level, they end up condemned by their own logic. By the time they acquire phronesis, it's too late for them. The cunning of reason has reversed their logic on them, and they actually have to negate themselves. So their heads are cut off, symbolic of the rationalists losing their head in the encounter with the real world. So as I said, I was sort of confused about this since I had an hour. I do have a lot more material that I'd be happy to get into, but I think I've used up my 15 minutes. So,
you have about a 5-minute sort of cushion.
Okay.
So,
well, I guess so. If I was going to choose one section, I guess I'll focus on why I think we shouldn't see Voltaire as actually rejecting Leibniz in the end. So he ends up with a similar metaphysics. This is what I argue, except rather than maybe a rationalist, realist approach, we end up with a more pragmatic approach. This comes to view through the format of the novel itself. So whereas Leibniz focused on, kind of gives us the idea of a programmer and programming language. God is this programmer, and he comes up with the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire's an author, and the novel is a unity. And insofar as it presents a unity, it leaves us with these sort of metaphysical presuppositions. And Voltaire is forced to acknowledge that the evil events in the novel, if they had not occurred, it would not be the novel that it was. And so while Voltaire is not all-knowing or all-powerful, and he cannot be said to have created the best of all possible novels in an absolute sense, the relationship between artistic creation and Leibniz's metaphysics is not lost on Voltaire. So at the very end, he has Pangloss, who's his philosopher character, as a satirization of Leibniz, say this to Candide: "There's a concatenation of events in this best of all possible worlds. For if you had not been kicked out of the magnificent castle for love of Miss Cunegonde, if you had not been put into the Inquisition, if you had not walked over America, if you had not stabbed the Baron, if you had not lost all your sheep from the fine country of El Dorado, you would not be here eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts." To which Candide replies, "All that is very well, but let us cultivate our garden." This is obviously a deflated picture, but it's comedic. Eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts is no small feat. It says something about the world. And Candide has traveled through much of Europe and the New World in this novel. And this message here, like, but let us cultivate our garden, I think sneaks in this political component that is, again, keeping with my attempt to return to Aristotle a bit here. Phronesis plus philosophical intellectual training prepares us for the political work. But if we try and jump to the political work, lacking phronesis, we risk ending up in the situation of the revolutionary leadership beheaded at the darkness of noon with the confrontation of our own logic. And just very quickly in closing, so the presuppositions that have crept in here, we've already spoken of the unity presupposed in the work of the novelist and how it reflects our logic on the thoughts about God. And Voltaire's quote, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him," therefore could be read as a bashful version of the stronger, "If we attempt to live and cultivate our garden," by which we mean metaphorically the world, creating the globe, we would find it impossible if we tried to do it without God. So God is not only something that we would have to create. In fact, God is already there, hidden in the presuppositions of our practices that are necessary for our goal and for life to carry on. I think I'll end there for now. Thank you.
All right. I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Leo for insightful talk. Now we go to the sort of general Q&A. I'll open it up to everyone generally. I guess my job now is to just keep the order of questions going. If you could use the raise hand function, or I guess just jump in, that'd be appreciated. If not, if no one has anything, then I guess I could ask a couple questions. All right, Jen has something.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, Leo. It's nice to meet you. Officially.
Yes.
Thanks for being here. So, I was doing administrative things and missed a couple of the important parts. So I just was wondering if you could briefly emphasize again what you most were hoping to get out of the workshopping discussion here in terms of where you're going next with the project.
Sure. I mean, I actually admit I was sort of confused, and I prepared a 50-minute presentation with slides and stuff. So I guess I was hoping at that point, I guess I was hoping for some feedback. This is part of a much longer work, so it's sort of hard to get it it would be sort of hard to get really helpful feedback without going into kind of the bigger framework of that work. So I really just wanted to share and see what came of it. But I think particularly of interest to me is this tendency, which certainly has been in my life, which is sort of the delaying of happiness in order to pursue sort of an abstract idea of justice. And I think that there's a lot of political problems now that seem so large that a lot of young people feel that they have to solve things that are impossible, but they're existential, so they feel that they can't get on with their regular life. So there's this tension between kind of a hedonistic, actually more Epicurean version towards just escapism through partying, drugs, whatever, addiction. And then on the opposite side, this like sort of Puritan impulse to just delay happiness until everything is solved all at once. We see that with the climate crisis a lot. COVID is sort of like this, like COVID has no end. It just, we don't know how it would end. So there's always going to be people at risk from infection. There's always those who are vulnerable. Do we mask forever? Do we, so this tension I feel is very much with us. And I guess my real main thesis is that I think we need to, I was trying to carve a path between these two extremes and show that political activity is possible, but the way to approach it requires that we shift an emphasis towards teaching phronesis, really understanding your own self-interest, and that this for me, Wittgenstein has been very helpful in this. So, but I think I cut someone off. I think maybe Kristopher was going to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I just kind of want to pick up on that last point. It's a really interesting kind of suggestion. It sounds like a cool project, and I'm intrigued. So I guess kind of this is maybe a self-serving question, because I've been thinking about this a lot, but kind of metaphilosophically, if the kind of solution is to teach phronesis, I guess two questions here. What exactly do you see kind of the purpose or aim or goal, the end of philosophy as being? Is it that kind of education? And then what do you think that looks like in practice? We walk into the philosophy classroom, or we're out on the street corner, or kind of like, what does that look like?
Right. Thank you. So first, I think, I'm happy to basically parrot Aristotle on the first part, which is that, and why I called this talk originally a radical approach is because I see it as closer to what philosophy was to the ancients. And I think the modern period sort of started this, it was necessary. It's been really fruitful. A lot of great things has come out of the kind of Cartesian and a detour. And I have a lot of respect for that epistemology, but it's like, I think the intellectualism has been severed from this sort of roots. And Aristotle was very clear: don't teach it too soon. Don't teach politics too soon. But philosophy is supposed to prepare you for a couple of things, to teach, to do science, or to be a politician, to serve politically. And that's what our aim should be always, I think, if we're teaching philosophy. So for me, as someone who, was sort of nerdy and introverted in many ways and struggled with this tension when I was in university between like addiction and then my kind of overly intellectual self, which were sort of at war with each other. Wittgenstein was really helpful for me, but I think he's limited to a certain extent. But I'm part of the crew, I think, that's trying to go beyond him and like plug him back in as a philosopher, as opposed to like the anti-philosopher that Bedeau and others like call him, characterize him as. But so this is just like, learn that language includes all of these very subtle, even not like nonverbal parts of language. So learning to read other people, learning to be present, and which I still struggle with, obviously. In the classroom, how do you do that well? Well, maybe like there's maybe part of the pedagogy of like people like me who sometimes dominate a classroom, and like I've got all the answers and it's more about cleverness. There's not really a place for people to actually meet, and it doesn't feel like you're actually ever really present. Like you're always kind of, it's like you're trying to be in the forum before you're ready to be in the forum, sort of thing. And I think Wittgenstein is just a great reminder. Like he just brings us back to just how, no, language is social. You learn it socially. It doesn't start with Descartes' clear and distinct ideas. That's not how knowledge begins, right? Like, you know, his discussion on pain is so important, because it's like the basis of language is like the fact that we have these shared pre-linguistic vocalizations that like act as signposts that we can attach, that we can teach, then we can then construct language onto. And it's this highly social aspect. And the people who are participating in happiness in like a non-addictive way are already doing it. So if you learn how to do that first before trying to like create a new and better version, a blueprint, and then bring it down. Anyway, hopefully that's a start of an answer. But
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I actually had a question. If no one is using the raise hand function, mainly just about the historical exegesis you sort of lay out. You mentioned that sort of in the pre-modern, or I guess maybe pre-contemporary philosophical world, metaphysics and theology were intertwined subjects. Obviously, that's very much the case for Leibniz. But you know, you mentioned the French Revolution, which I think is sort of a political and then later a philosophical, with at least the 19th century sort of hermeneutics of suspicion, at least decentering of God. God plays an increasingly less important role as the 19th century and then later the 20th century roll around. And I was wondering to what extent that complicates your sort of historical exegesis here. How does the sort of, I guess, death of God as the primacy of sort of the philosophical concept change your outlook, or change the way in which we can relate to hope and optimism and pessimism?
Thank you, Samuel. Yeah, important questions. I guess my feeling or my position on this is twofold. I think that yes, there's lots of talk of the death of God. For even though Nietzsche said, right, he saw that as like, we've killed him in our hearts. So there's this sense that it no longer worked for us. It was no longer working to inspire us in this way towards community and optimism and faith. But I would argue that metaphysically, we always retain some sort of structural God. So like if you believe in the concept of truth, objective truth, some outside real, and if you combine that with an internal real concept we'll just use Lacan's concept of the real, as I inherited through Zizek. Like, you already have the metaphysical presuppositions that there's a truth between your interaction between the outer and the inner. And I think it's a very so anything from like the stability of object, like object constancy, continuance, permanence, whatever, all of these sort of presuppositions that we like rely on in our daily practices is just like all of deep trust. It's like a deep trust that we need for our daily practices. That's, to me, very close to faith. And that's why like so many of the top physicists, they're not like hardcore atheists. They will just be like, I don't know, but like it's weird stuff we see, we don't really know, but at the same time, we believe that our project is going to get us somewhere. That's already an optimism. Like, that's, to me, the idea that thinking is important. Just this was also really fundamental to Leibniz. He targets this idea that he calls lazy reason or lazy sophism. He wants to distinguish between faith and fatalism as he sees it appearing in different ways, right? So lazy sophism or lazy reason is just this idea like whatever will be, and like a premature, it is what it is that we hear so often. It is what it is. You know, ironically, Hegel said it is what it is, but you only get there after learning what it is, which is the whole point of philosophy. But so that's part of how so sorry, just quickly about lazy reason. Leibniz says, even if you're the most fatalist, stoic, or whatever, dismissive, it's all in God's hands, blah, 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 or it's not up to me, there's no free will. If someone puts a cup full of poison in front of you, tells you it's fatal, it's, you know, deadly poison, and you're not suicidal, you're not going to drink it. And he says, that's clear evidence that you believe in free choice, and you believe that you have a responsibility to make good decisions when it's in your own self-interest. So these things, like, again, that's one way I think they creep in. And then I think at a psychological level, that metaphysics is reflected again. And so I in my other work, I do use a lot of Lacan inherited through Zizek and the idea of the big other, etc. There's this psychological space, you know, whether it's the, you know, Lacan develops Freud's idea of the ego ideal. There's this like gaze that we want to impress. That's why we virtue signal, you know, which is what we do before we've arrived at the true faith, according to Leibniz. So we have this psychologically, this metaphysical structure that's like shared, then gets duplicated at a psychological level. So that's part of how I would attempt to answer that.
All right. Thanks for the response.
Hit me very hard if you think it's like doesn't work or whatever, you know.
Yeah, I just don't want to dominate the Q&A session.
Yeah.
So I'll cede the point. I guess you don't have to use the raise hand function if you don't want. You can just jump in.
I might just jump back in. So I'm thinking it's really interesting, kind of, that you're focusing at least here on Leibniz and you know, kind of so-called Enlightenment European thinkers. And it's interesting that you'd kind of talk about that as a time of optimism. I don't think that's wrong. I think that's right, actually. But you know, you think about the kind of historical situatedness of everything that was going on in Europe in the 17th century. And it's insane, right? I mean, you've got the Civil War in England, you've got the 30 Years' War, you have the plague, you have the Inquisition, you have, right, all of these sorts of things happening all at once. There is a question in here. I'm just kind of getting to it, I think, as I talk. but so I guess I kind of wonder, you went after Descartes a little bit, um, and I think that that's fair. A lot of folks kind of read him that way, but I think that there's a sense in which Descartes could actually be really helpful to your project here. Often the reading is like really focused on the meditations, and it's taking the meditations kind of at face value. But many of his projects were really, I think, more like phronesis aimed, right? The Passions is a really nice piece where he's like, look, this is how you ought to live practically in the world, given these foundational assumptions about the way things work. And the famous tree of philosophy everybody loves to talk about. He says the roots are metaphysics and the trunk is physics. And then he continues though, and he says, but you don't get fruit from the roots or the trunk, you get it from the branches, and that's medicine, mechanics, and morals. And so I'm wondering, like, Leibniz is obviously a really great example, but do you see that kind of call to phronesis, call to practical wisdom, present in other modern figures, or do you think, like, I guess maybe, so the question is this: when do you think that turn from that to the kind of abstract, abstruse, scientific approach to whatever it is that we're doing happened? Sorry, that was a really long, rambling question.
Oh, thank you so much. I 100% agree. I actually gave a talk a few weeks ago on Descartes, and sort of related to this, and I prefaced that, as I did with some of the other figures, is that I'm always straw man. Like, I don't assume that I've thought anything that Descartes didn't think. Like, and obviously the opposite, right? Brilliant thinker, and you see it even in the meditations that he's very aware of. Right, the reason he has to detach himself from action, as he my one thing is the dualism of body and mind, right? Like, that he doesn't think thinking is a kind of action. He separates that out. But like, he says that because when you're engaged in your practices, you can't help but accept common sense, right? Like, he can't apply that skepticism without receding entirely from the world. So absolutely. And my goal here is kind of plug into this, to the last question a bit too, is like, I think a lot of the things that we accomplish with faith, or were accomplished with faith, can be done almost secularly. Like, there's like a pragmatics of the faith that I'm also sort of working on, that it's very much my interest to keep the Enlightenment, to keep science. I'm not interested in rehabilitating the pre-modern period in some way that cuts out everything that came afterwards. But historically, I don't really know enough to give you a good answer to the second part, but I think my encounter with the like, I guess, like, again, a sort of parody of the analytic philosophical tradition, Bertrand Russell and before, where that Wittgenstein himself was so embedded with and then rejects, is sort of, to me, just like, obviously there's room for that kind of fine work, but if philosophers turn their back on metaphysics and these sort of big questions, that we cede the field, like, we just leave it. And like, scientists stop respecting philosophy. They think that we don't have anything to add. We try and be more like scientists and make our paper more like, to prove that we actually have worth. Meanwhile, people turn to horoscopes because, there's Yeah, that's the best I can answer.
Yeah, and that's really awesome. I like that. I don't know if you're familiar. There's some stuff kind of happening in meta philosophy right now that it sounds like would be really kind of friendly um, to the things you're doing. Like, so Hadot with the philosophy as a way of life kind of focuses on spiritual exercise. And then there are some kind of versions of this that are coming out that are, John Cooper, has kind of a more rationalist take on that same kind of thing, where it's the really strict rational activity is kind of the way of life that philosophy leads you to. And then there are these folks today like Timothy Williamson, who's just like, no, philosophy is a non-natural science, and it just is science, and we should just keep doing that. Which I think is exactly like the foil that you're pushing back against. And so yeah, this is cool stuff. I don't like Samuel. I don't want to dominate here, but it's pretty cool.
Thank you. We do follow each other on Twitter, so I'm going to follow up with you on those names.
Jonathan has a hand raised.
So if I'm taking this correctly, the aim here is practical, a kind of practical action by means of philosophical reflection that leads to a kind of more optimistic, state of affairs, right? Wherein, say, if we take optimism broadly construed, a optimistic state of affairs is one that enables human flourishing, if we're going to be really Aristotelian about this, right? So my question is pretty basic, right? To what end is our optimistic appraisal of a situation vis-a-vis philosophy dependent on our own subject positions, right? So an optimistic appraisal of a situation from, say, the position of Jeff Bezos, regardless of what philosophical methodology you use, might be one of hope for a future wherein technology resolves all of our problems and we're traveling by Hyperloop and so on and so forth, right? Wait, Hyperloop is Elon Musk. So I'm mixing up my billionaire supervillain types today. So whereas, no amount of Aristotelian reflection, right, will produce an optimistic result for somebody who's working a 9-to-5 and is burdened by student loan debt, right? So how do you square the circle of social conditions as structuring the kinds of things we can be optimistic about and the ways that we're optimistic, right? Because the 9-to-5 dude might find, dragging Musk and Bezos out onto the lawns of their $1 million mansions and reenacting the French Revolution as a means to securing a more optimistic future. Whereas philosophical reflection on the behalf of Bezos and Musk would say, yeah, no, we can't have that, because that means I get my head lopped off and I must, give up the money I've made vis-a-vis my emerald mines. So square the circle for me, because this is one of the things that I find problematic about Aristotle, right? Aristotle, and most of the pre-Socratics don't consider everybody as capable of doing this. Well, I mean, unless of course you're a slave or something, but put that aside, right? They seem to be largely not super concerned about the distinctions in the social positioning of the inquirer. So square this circle for me.
Sure, I can of course do that. Thank you, Jonathan. So just quickly to correct you a little bit, I mean, the little Aristotle I'm using, borrowing, cheating here with, is mainly about, is more about an emphasis on phronesis, the importance of people learning to identify their own self-interest before they even begin any kind of philosophical training. Because of our ages, and when we go to university, that's probably not possible. So they're going to have to happen sort of simultaneously. But I think your question is absolutely fair. Look, I've worked really horrible jobs. My life is still, I struggle with this all the time. But so did Job, right? Right? Like Job, who was supposedly most favored, righteous character, blessed by God. Job goes into the darkness. Job says, I wish that I was never born. And we need to, like, so I don't think that like despair is even necessarily dependent on your social position entirely. So that's part of it. So, but it's definitely a question that needs to be addressed. Quickly, if I could, I just would probably introduce Leibniz, something about Leibniz that's really critical to understanding this here. Okay, so secondly, from Aristotle, I also get that the aim of philosophical training should be preparing us for politics. So rather than trying to be super clever and solve these really, there's a place for that, but we need really good political leaders. We need people who understand politics and who can help teach and use the social media we have to bring people along so that people understand. But so to try and answer this a bit obliquely as best as I can in a few minutes, in the Theodicy, Leibniz, one of the things he wants to correct is like a naive realist, or like the cave version of good and evil, right? That's the whole problem. It's the problem of evil. That's what theodicy is. How do you explain that things are good if shit happens? And if I'm in a shit job and people treat me like garbage and there's prejudice and all these things come out in Candide, right? Every single one of them. Imprisonment for wrong reasons, persecution, racism, natural disasters, torture, all of it. It's all in Candide. But what that tries to bring out, I'm arguing, is that what Leibniz said is that, look, he's repeating the monotheism of Moses and of Augustine. Evil is not an efficient cause. Evil is deficient. Evil is tied up with ignorance, confusion, and these sorts of things. It can arise because we don't understand our own self-interest. We think we know what's in our interest. When it can arise even if we have we have good intentions, right? This is again why I talked about the French Revolution. The intentions of the Jacobins on paper are excellent. Who doesn't want equality, liberty, and fraternity, and the rights of all, the universal rights of man, which will extend beyond the group that they intended it for. But even good intentions can lead to hell, right? So the idea is we really need, for Aristotle, a good politician is good because their self-interest overlaps with the self-interest of the state. They align. There's certain people that it aligns for, and it aligns for not in every state at every time, right? That's just a feature of the world. To have free will, we need to be able to make mistakes and bad judgments, but the political consequences are enormous. So Leibniz says Nero caused far more harm than any earthquake ever has. That's what Leibniz says, right? So if philosophy isn't preparing our political leaders, then who is? Then what are we doing as philosophers if that's not one of our main objectives? So that's part of how I try and finagle my way out of it. But also there's this mysterious quality about practical knowledge or phronesis that Thomas Aquinas identifies. That practical knowledge is the cause of what it understands. So this weird process, right? Like the belief that, okay, if my situation isn't the best that I would want it to be, first of all, like there are ways that I can transform my situation. it's beyond my, through, for example, study, learning to identify what's in my interest and adjusting because of that. And somehow this has this transformative effect on the world. And part of that is in your changing understanding of what good and evil are. And instead of seeing evil everywhere, remember, as Hegel says, this is Hegelian as well, the gaze that sees evil everywhere is itself evil. It simply does not understand what good and evil is. It's in an ignorant state. It's still in a state of ignorance. I think there's some cause for hope. And I think a lot of the most incredible political leaders of the last 100 years have actually been people with a deep faith and a deep optimism. That's the best I can do. I probably rambled a bit too long.
Yeah, Jonathan, I'll let you do the follow-up.
Yeah, hit me hard.
So I have a little bit of trouble with your, say, deployment of Job in this context, right? Because if I'm correct, if I recall the story of Job correctly, Job's suffering was an end result of a wager between God and the devil, such that Job was put to the test to satisfy, I guess, sacrilegiously God's arrogance, right? So one of my concerns with, say, using Job as an example is the degree to which Job's kind of example is forced by situations well beyond his control, right? Situations that are ultimately like, if I was some evil administrator and made a wager with like my deanlets that I could create a situation so toxic that it would force a given department to demonstrate its value to the institution, and so on and so forth, right? Like, that seems to be an artificial kind of organization of a situation wherein we can study hope, right? So this is less of a question about how would you resolve that, and more of a question about why use an example that relies on kind of explicitly supernatural elements to demonstrate demonstrate your argument, right?
Yes, thank you. I only chose Job because, first of all, it's shared cult, like most people get the reference, but it's also the point was just simply that what the story is telling us is that it doesn't matter how deep your faith is. Don't expect that difficult times aren't going to make you despair. Christ despairs on the cross. Christ calls out, "Why have you forsaken me?" So I'm not for some toxic positivity mantra. Like, we're just, because it's the best of all possible. This is the kind of thing I want to parody that I suggest Voltaire, why he does what he does. If we take this is the best of all possible worlds at face value, it's going to fall apart as soon as we hit reality. But Leibniz's whole point is that these things arise because people have free choice. That doesn't mean that you don't have shitty. That doesn't mean that universities aren't in a state of mess. Like, they very well may be, right? Like, I personally have some very deep problems with the universities on some level, but your ability to fight against that or change that, it's not a guarantee that you will be able to win each and every one of those battles, like as in an individual. But let me just quickly say, like, this is one of the, I'll use like a stock example. Probably most of you have heard this, right? For much of the 2010s, we spent our time fighting in these little factions over completely absurd non-political problems, basically non-political problems about things that were then weaponized against progressives. And then we ended up with Trump. And then we ended up with Bader Ginsburg out. And then we ended up, because, you know, it's not feminist to say that she should step down before. Like, ignorance has very serious political consequences, and we can end up in a very bad situation. So it's important, right? Like, there's this stuff we clearly don't want, but then there's a whole bunch of other things that gets in the way. It gets weaponized, ends up being weaponized against real progressives, people who are actually trying to extend like the real core rights, like the right to vote, which a lot of Americans are now losing. Like, you know, it's serious, but that's what happens when like the political discourse gets clouded. And I'm going to blame that part of that on philosophy, like, because why not? No, I shouldn't do that. But if we aren't stepping up, and if we aren't really taking our training seriously, and as I'm trying to argue, that requires that we learn to see things a little bit more clearly, like really recognize our self-interest, then we're ceding the field to much worse actors.
We do have a single minute left, so if anyone wants a very pithy final statement, I'll open the floor to that.
I'm also going to tell people to add me, and like I'm looking for people to talk to. So if you're at all interested in talking more, please, you know, follow me, send me a DM, or get in touch with me later in this thing. I also have a Substack with related content where I'm basically publishing regularly. So yeah, get in touch if you're interested. Thank you so much. And thanks to the organizers, Angry Cassie and the Gender Pope, because actually Cog Tweedo has really been huge in my own process, because I just wouldn't have finished this if it wasn't for this event. So thank you all.
Right, it is 9:30, I believe. During the break, the original Zoom room is open, so if you want to go and hang out there, it's fine. I think we start at 9:45. I do have familial obligations, so I probably won't be here the rest of the day. Maybe for the next one, but nothing after that, unfortunately. But
so should I stay in this room for another 15 minutes in case anyone wants to, or are you going to leave and it'll close?
It's really up to anyone what they want to do. I think everyone's just going back to the original room though.
Yeah, this room is going to stay open, but I think people are going to migrate over to the main room.
I just had a feeling Jonathan had a few more right hands in there for me that he might.
I mean, there's a couple of them, right? So you might be better served looking at some of the kind of pragmatist accounts of what philosophy does as a mode of inquiry. The resources you use for the nature of philosophy seem to be almost strictly Western in a sense, right? So when we're thinking about kind of practical, optimistic actions, there's a lot of Buddhist literature on the nature of what we might call optimism, or the necessity of optimism insofar as we need to believe in the possibility of, say, resolving suffering through the release of harmful attachments such that we can attain enlightenment, which is a very different kind of practical objective of philosophical reflection than what we would think of in, say, the Western tradition, specifically insofar as how that would appears differently based on dependently conditioned environs, so on and so forth. Right? So I mean, I have right hands of that sort, but
I appreciate it, and I'll get in touch with you. I'd love to broaden beyond the Western tradition. Just say that my biggest project is actually I'm trying to build. I use basically Wittgenstein's expressivist account on pain language to build a new approach to pragmatism. That's what I've been working on, and I've written a lot on it. But I would consider myself a Buddhist in some respects, and I studied Theravada Buddhism for several years and read quite a bit about it. But I haven't. You're right. I'm woefully ignorant on non-Western philosophers. So, expect a DM from me, or I'll message you in the chat and the other.
That's fine. My DMs are typically open.
I know you're also you have other obligations, so I don't expect you to take me on as a private tutor or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of cool how Jonathan was able to express what I had some of the problems with it in such a, I don't know, very concise and like incisive manner. I do think, like, picking up on the non-Western element, I do think Wang Yangming might be interesting, at least the inquiry on great learning, because his whole argument in that is, at least for ethical concerns, knowledge and action are intertwined. So like knowledge of an ethical fact is not truly knowledge if you fail to act on it. So like if you know that cheating, take an example from Brian Van Norden. If you know that cheating on an exam and plagiarism is morally wrong, but you still do it, you don't actually know it, because part of knowing that ethical fact is that it has to bind your action, or it has to be motivating in some sort of action guiding capacity.
Yeah, but that motivation, right, and the capacity for, say, knowing an ethical rule is limited to the degree to which we've polished the mirror of our shin, right? So we polish the mirror of our shin through an educational praxis that supplies us with principles which purportedly guide our actions, such that ethics and action come together. So there's a lot. So there's a pretty compelling argument vis-a-vis Wang Yangming for studying ethical principles, but testing them out in an experiential context and not being absolutely beholden to said principles. Because if you polish the mirror of your shin such that it reflects the principles that you are engaging in, a mirror never reflects things the same way twice, right? It's always a reflection of whatever's put before it. So insofar as you need to, say, polish the mirror of your shin through education and learning, your shin is not expected to be a one-to-one mirror of the principles that you've learned, but a mirror of the principles as enacted within the situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why I think in my paper, I talk a little bit about Wittgenstein and, this idea of language games. Like Leibniz thinks that he could create a universal language, that the logic is going to be a calculus like geometry, right? That's what he actually had, that goal. But Wittgenstein's like, no, you learn in situ. Like you learn, there are certain language games you cannot possibly learn except in situ, which means with other people. And so I do think Leibniz understands, as I was trying to get across, that your moral assumptions may be wrong. Like we may actually begin as like moral realists in the cave, and moral truths might be one of those things that we cling to most tightly. And so that that's part of it. But just quickly, I wanted to add also, like, guys, like I was going to say this at the beginning of the talk, but I got a little bit thrown off by the changes. But like one of my sister's ex-boyfriends nicknamed me the Darkness. So don't think I struggle with this every single day. I'm not a live, laugh, love kind of type of person. And like, I'm extremely rebellious, and I have been extremely rebellious politically throughout my life. But this is sort of an account of part of what I've learned from that process. I'm now 35. I went about it wrong a lot of the time. and I'm starting to understand that. So I'm trying to fight. I'm trying to find a way to be um, to modify and enjoy happiness a little bit more. So. All right. Well, I guess I'm going to go back to the main room. Thank you, Samuel, for moderating. Thanks, guys, for all the questions. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
See you in the other room.
See you.
Mhm.
Hello.
Howdy.
So I am, as of some shuffling around of people at last minute, I am now chairing this session. Although,
Cool.
Yeah. So obviously, the intention with the coffee hour talks is to be, pretty informal kind of conversation. So I think the idea will be for you, Jonathan, to have 10 or 15 minutes, or if that works for you, to kind of describe the project before we launch into the conversation, or if you'd like more or less time, that'd be fine too.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, so it's 11:01 now, so I'll start by saying we're going to have Jonathan McKinney here talking through some cool ideas with us. That's right, double Jonathan. And Jonathan's a doctoral candidate at University of Cincinnati and going to tell us about hope in the shell, why it's wonderful that our brains are not computers. So take it away. Tell us this. The title is so intrinsically interesting.
Oh, we're gonna have fun. Don't you worry. Yeah, we like the puns. So I'll go ahead and do my extremely long and elaborate PowerPoint presentation. I chaired a session earlier. I am super excited to finally get a chance to present at CogTweedo. I've kind of been in the background and helping out. I think it's a super exciting place, and I am really hopeful about the future of CogTweedo and the kind of community it brings together. So I'll probably do less arguing and more introducing and hand waving, because I'm not a very good philosopher and I don't like talking with philosophers all that much, but I like this community and I think that it's really fruitful to engage in these sort of talks. So what I want to do is sort of create a space where I've brought together a bunch of my weird resources and ideas and see what you have to say. So I got my timer set. I might go a little bit over because I have far too many slides, but I'm a 6th-year PhD student. So
totally fine.
Cool. Sweet. So like Daniel said, Jonathan McKinney, dissertation fellow, PhD candidate, master's graduate, Center of Cognition, Action, and Perception. I'm that guy, sort of parallel to Dr. Jonathan Flowers, who does a bit of embodied stuff, but I'm on the cognitive science side of things. I've included a bunch of little breadcrumbs or perhaps bagel crumbs for those of you who like to watch movies and see subtle things. I won't necessarily call everything out, but hopefully you enjoy this weird little production that I've put together. So thank you very much, CogTweedo, for the opportunity to share coffee. I have to pause for a moment to acknowledge my sensei, Dr. Flowers, the Seeker of Revenge, who has contributed a lot over the years and months, inadvertently through our discussions, but also multiple presentations on some ideas related to this. Also, hashtag read Dewey if you want to get to the bottom of it. I'll be talking a little bit about intelligence. I'm hoping that I'll get to this point where I can provide hope, answers to the questions about what we should be hopeful for, despite how bad everything is. We'll try and keep it PG-13. And I want to end on a note of wonder. We'll see if I get there. I started with this idea that definitely stems from an embodied and radical perspective and doing non-Western philosophy, and also just being a general outsider in philosophy departments. I basically think philosophy of mind is a really silly thing that goes on, and I've got a lot of weird things to say about it. It's partially my advisor's fault because the first lines of his book are philosophy of mind is dead. So we'll see maybe if I'm just the chaotic offspring of that. I think we're profoundly stupid. Human beings are profoundly stupid, and I'm actually pretty happy about that. So I'm going to start the first part of my talk sort of saying a little bit about intelligence. I'm not going to solve it all here because that's not my job. But I'm going to talk a little bit about something called loans of intelligence, and then a little bit about what I think over-focus on content sort of causes, what problems are caused. So not a content warning in the traditional sense, but maybe in the pun. I want to start with this idea of a loan of intelligence, and then maybe why we can use that to push against how people usually talk about intelligence or minds. This is a big old quote from Dennett back before I was born. But basically the idea is when you develop a theory about something like mental stuff, rationality, thinking, language, art, and you basically construct piece by piece, like a really intricate philosophy of mind or even a neuroscience. You end up taking out loans of intelligence. What you're doing is you're imbuing parts of your body or parts of the mental process with content processing power. And you're taking the explanation of what things are in the world, your understanding of perception, your faculties of reason, your ability to use language, and you're storing them in the brain. And you've got little boxes about what those things are, and you're inflating the importance of that side of the equation. Well, this creates a loan of intelligence. You're sort of banking on the fact that eventually maybe neuroscience will be complete, or your total story will give a convincing case of how it is you can account for all this meaningful stuff going inside this squishy pink stuff in your head. However, if you never pay back those loans, which I think the embodied folks, specifically the schools in which that I operate, say that we don't. In philosophy of mind, cognitive science, traditionally speaking, and neuroscience, also in artificial intelligence, that you end up with sort of like a theory with a bunch of holes in it. Someone like a weird Nietzschean can come around and say the philosophy of mind is dead, right? In that sense, you didn't fill in the holes and you put the boat on the ocean, and oops, you've run into some problems. That's not to say that I think cognitive science is horrible, not to say that AI needs to give up. It's not to say that we don't have minds. It's just to say that there are loans of intelligence out there when you inflate what's going on in the brain. And I want to give a basic story and show you some of the sort of canonical images of ecological psychology. It's known as a very radical school, and we're very somewhat known as religious in the embodied world to our Saint Jimmy, who is Gibson. But I just got to give you a sort of snapshot in what we talk about and how it is that we can deflate the brainy stuff and start talking a little bit more about the world. Also, I know that there are a lot of closet Cartesians in this group, and that I am a reformed sort of coming back to Descartes after I've sort of failed my first qualifying exam on Descartes because I tried to say things that are true about his work, but weren't canonically sort of accepted. But I want to sort of, a lot of people take pot shots at Descartes, and I don't think it's his fault. This is the sort of canonical way to start a loans of intelligence situation. There are two sort of important ones for embodied cognitive science. One is that when you take up a dualism or a trialism, if you want to get really technical about Descartes, you divide the agent from the world, you divide the mind from your perceptual faculties, you break things into little components, you have to process meaning, generate meaning, create image, create depth, create value, and you have to imbue that in this sort of mechanical, biomechanical, physiological system, and then thus project it onto the world. That has two loans of intelligence. One is in your brain. You got to have a lot of mechanisms that are making the world make sense. And two, the world has to be deflated. It's meaningless, motionless, lifeless, and otherwise it's called impoverished. This is the impoverishment of the stimulus. And this is where we get this myth that you see the world as an inverted upside down or inverted flat image that is meaningless. And all you see is a world of these objects, which we then are separate from ourselves. When in reality, a perception ends up being a little bit more transactional and engaged, or in fact, there are a lot of other embodied dimensions that we know about perception. Also, a side note, if you're into the Descartes breadcrumb, he says things about how the brain, the mind is not the captain of a ship, but we can't stall on that too long. We got to keep going. So the dualism and trialism and impoverished stimuli create loans of intelligence that are inherited by those theories to follow. That is cognitivism, artificial intelligence, even philosophy of mind today, the sort of stuff that I'm not allowed to talk about. Ecological psychologists instead try and talk about the world in terms of our relational access to it. They're very Deweyan, although they don't necessarily know it. They follow Merleau-Ponty in some sense. One element here is that instead of you being a separate perceiving organism away from your environment that is distant from you, that you then see populated with objects that your mind creates for you, instead you have a position in space that you have relative information about, and when you move around, that relative information actually changes in law-like ways. So if you can pick up on what is called like this law-like information, or information L is what they refer to it as, it actually reduces how much processing you're going to need on the inside in order to understand where things are in three-dimensional space. So a really great example of this is that when you Google psychology today, which you should never do, but if you ever do that and you look up visual illusions, almost all of the new fun explanations of them are brain. They trick your brain. The blue and black / white and gold dress, it's a brain problem that you need to switch your neurons for. And all of the studies and talk are in the brain, where you scan brains and you're like, oh my gosh, the neurons are doing stuff. Our explanations are finally getting there. But you don't realize that if you just were in the room with that dress, the way that you would solve that problem is literally moving around, right? So most visual illusions don't occur naturally, or if they do, they're very contingent upon certain perspectives that are spatially oriented compared to you. So a lot of literature on visual illusions are highly abstract, like on pieces of paper, two-dimensional illusions. Well, those are dependent upon a very, very strange version of perception, which in reality, most of our lives are wiggling around. So this was a really fun illusion. If you go to one of these like fun houses, I've been to one in Japan, where you can make people appear different heights next to each other. I got a fun picture with another student doing this. It entirely depends upon viewing it from a very particular space, which is why there's a little X on the floor of where you perceive it. So an ecological psychologist would just say, yeah, but walk around, right? And you'll find out that this is actually sort of, there are ways to discover the illusion or understand it or understand your world maybe directly, or that is through your relationship with the world itself. Okay, so by just talking about illusions, if they trick our brains, you ignore the role of your body in the world. So Descartes talks about the union of the mind and the body, but again, don't talk about Descartes right now. He's fine. We'll get him back maybe later. But even if mind-body dualism is true and the brains are some kind of computers in this sort of somewhat Cartesian paradigm, which is sort of standard, focus on the brain excludes value information. More importantly, if the brain is not a supercomputer, then we may be able to find new ways of addressing ignorance and radicalization. These are like when you say, you ask me, how can you find hope in all this terrible world we're in? I try and answer it in this really weird and elongated way. There might be ways of addressing things like ignorance that escape focuses on content, that is mental content. So where does the hope come from in this economy? What if, instead of assuming we're intelligent supercomputers while ignoring how profoundly stupid we are all the time, we just didn't do that? Consider the loans of intelligence of language. One way to consolidate them is to take an ecological approach to linguistics. So one of my favorite authors, someone I'm working very closely with, is something called an ecolinguist, and it's taking ecological psychology in its most radical form and applying it to linguistics. The short version of the weird stuff he's up to is he's a linguist, and if you present anything about language to this person, he'll say, yeah, stop talking about words, stop talking about sentences, stop talking about language. You should talk about the embodied practice of languaging. And that turns out to be really hard to do, but it does distribute cognition. It distributes something that is tended to be highly abstract, mental, and reserved for things like formal philosophy of mind and language, and it puts it in this sort of embodied relational sort of perspective. So he likens language, first of all, as this ongoing process between individuals. That is what we're doing now, maybe what I'm doing at you. Perhaps in the Q&A, we'll be doing it at each other or with each other. But language is also a little bit weirder than that. Like, we can write it down. We can use it to change our environment. We can maybe even paint our environment differently. That is not using words, but changing the meaning of our environment, linguistically outside of just writing words on the walls. And if you could view it this way, language is actually an ability that is likened to something like a spider being able to weave a web or a beaver being able to build a dam. It's what he calls it helps us extend our phenotype, but it's something called a situation transcending third party. That is like a tablet, a monument, the sort of a book, for example, even a linguistic practice or the D&D monster manual, something we can return to that is an artifact that will help us center our ability to communicate about a particular context. But thinking about language that way takes it out of our particular brains and into a space that we can share. Even if we're talking about a book holding the language and myself holding some sort of understanding of that language, it still ends up being it deflates the sort of need for drawing mental content from my brain, and it sort of helps us understand it more in a distributed and social way. And this is exactly what they're up to. This is the original work I was showing you is from 2011. They have one that's coming out. I think it's 2021, might be 2022. The pandemic makes time weird. But this is one thing they specifically focus on. The emphasis on human agency, and that is the entanglement of humans together in their environment and linguistic activity rather than language like units, obliviates the need to seek relations between language and the environment. That is to try and solve the impoverishment of the stimulus or solve mind-world or mind-body dualisms, right? Which is that sort of loan of intelligence. They are specifically tackling this loan of intelligence. And they're trying to talk about language as a form of human living, a way that you distribute your mind in space, but also over time. And that distribution sort of embodies it, which is pretty spicy, but also really fun. There's some parallel literature. I've done some presentations on this, talking about monuments and how monuments out in the world can be meaningful. But I just wanted to highlight a sort of parallel here. There's this notion in archaeology that when you go into an archaeological dig, you're not just finding knowledge, you're also finding ignorance, because objects you find there can mislead you, or the narrative interactions you have with them can perpetuate both. They can be knowledge generating, but they can also be ignorance generating. And so when you think about knowledge or ignorance in this way, outside of the brain, it's not that my brain lacks the knowledge about some tablet or misunderstands it, but rather my relationship with that object in the world can lead me to believe something that's wrong or false. For example, I use Confederate monuments as my example. They're designed specifically to suppress African Americans in the United States and affect voting activities in the South. But they're now the retooled narrative is they're actually historical, supposed to represent just the Confederacy, which is a benign, just historical sort of statue. It turns out that you can rewrite that, and then it causes a problem that people will literally believe it. It's that you can find the ignorance in the brains or in the behaviors of people, but you can also find it in space. So that distribution sort of helps us understand knowledge a little bit differently. I think it's helpful to consider insight and ignorance outside the skull. And if we do, it's good news, because I think it's easier to change our environment or tackle this kind of problem than it is to change other people's minds, which is a bit spooky. And I want to get to the wonderful part. And I want to go really fast because I'm almost at 15 minutes and I don't want to go too far beyond the intended time. And I want to talk a little bit about this very Deweyan, although they've only discovered that through people like me who have told them that, but very Deweyan program where I did my master's at the University of Hawaii. It's called P4C, or Philosophy for Children. P4C Hawaii is an ongoing transformative education program in the Hawaii school districts. It begins rather than ends with dialogue, and it strives to build spaces of intellectual safety, in other words, generating communities and considering philosophy as a sort of dialogical or even maybe Socratic co-activity that we do as groups rather than something that is about the content, like mastering what Descartes said. Is it important to get Descartes right? Yes, but it's actually better to create a space where we can explore what Descartes said, so that we all feel comfortable engaging with it, because it's going to reveal our different insights, but also some of the things we're carrying with us. And sometimes the things we're carrying with us would otherwise make philosophy or philosophical discourse hard to engage in. So it makes the content of the course a part of the practice itself. Self-reflection joins the text. So you have to bring the people into the content itself. So that takes away from this sort of like memorize what Descartes said, take an exam sort of situation. And they value wonder. They take this notion of wonder very seriously. This is where I draw that from. So P.S. they cite Dewey. And in so doing that, rethinking of content, I think, is especially important, because they engage with this philosophy not as the sort of a mastery of content, but a mastery of practice, or the sort of co-engagement. Okay, and I wanted to provide a very brief case study that I love telling about because it's super cool. It is Kailua High School. So Kailua High School, P4C was installed at the earliest level and then extended to all levels of the high school. Originally, it's a school in Oahu, in Hawaii. It has the demographics of the school is that you have a minority of white students and then a sort of majority of Native Hawaiian or non-white students. And this is kind of a sort of inversion of the typical United States high school. And as a result, and one thing that goes parallel with this racial demographic is that you have money, like the sort of white students are more, they have more resources or familial wealth, and Native Hawaiian students have less. So there's a tension that was created there. As a result, it was one of the most sort of racially violent and racially tense high schools in the country. It had acts of sort of higher levels of violence or tension than the average. As a result of applying P4C universally at this school, it went from one of the most violent schools in the country to one of the least violent schools in the country. This actually prompted them being visited by the Dalai Lama, and they engaged specifically in this kind of co-inquiry. It just turns out that if you come to class being racist and it comes up during class, right, through that dialogue of a space, you can actually reach a new understanding. You might not obliterate racism in the world, but it's going to change your perspective on it. And it creates a space to actually engage with it, to start caring about what other people think. And so again, it sort of shifts the content of the course from the topic itself, the sort of books, to each other. And it actually helped, the results are very, very astounding. So P4C holds that philosophy begins in wonder and that we're discouraged from wondering as we grow up. So luckily, it's something that we can practice together. And I want to say that if we can think of human beings this way, and we think of the problems that we're facing together as these like ignorance, not as trying to get people to realize that racism or transphobia or the ecological crisis are happening, right? Because that's just like getting the fact into the brain and saying, now you're going to be a better person. It turns out you actually need to start cultivate a space for them to understand the world differently, and also maybe give them opportunities to practice a different way of living, a different way of seeing, a different way of thinking. And methods like P4C show us that this actually works. So this is this is like Dewey in practice. When you engage this way, people actually change. which is not something they do if they read an article, right? And there was actually a cool study that I'm not that familiar with, which was when a bunch of Fox News viewers watched, I think it was CNN or some other moderate or benign news show, and they changed their mind because they actually got out of this bubble. Well, that's understanding it in a distributed way. It doesn't mean that we should throw out all the things about intelligence, but it's useful that if we're not this like supercomputer we're not this intelligent processing machine, we're some other kind of machine, that's actually pretty useful, right? And I love throwing Marie Kondo just to push people to, see the force. What are you, attached to the past or afraid of the future? Thank you very much. Only slightly over time. But that's my sort of interesting and weird ideas of a path to finding hope in all of this nonsense.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much. Let's thank our speaker. Very nice. So like I said, we're just gonna, I think this is like a, kind of informal space for conversation. So, we can start a queue if that seems necessary, but in the meantime, I'll just open it up and whoever wants to. I can start. Yeah, it was really interesting. I just don't know. I don't know. I guess I'm a kind of closet Cartesian, and I just don't know much about the embodied perspective. But what you're describing about the perspective of thinking of language as something humans do as more like the spider's webs than like this kind of internal processing thing. I think it just sounded really interesting. And I was wondering if you could say a little more about like how that comes up in the philosophy for children kind of thing. So you're describing that as like, I thought.
I'm missing the last part. For some reason, your audio is cut out. I heard philosophy for children, and then I heard a robot noise.
My internet sucks. I'm sorry.
You're back. It's okay.
Okay. Sorry. Did you just not hear the end of that at all?
I heard philosophy for children and then robot.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the kind of embodied perspective and like how that comes up in the case of philosophy for children. And I'm sorry for Jen and I are sharing the Wi-Fi, which is already pretty strained. So.
Oh, no worries at all. This is not an obvious connection because I'm the one making it in a lot of ways. I'm the person who studied at doing P4C as an embodied cognitive scientist, and I'm the one telling embodied cognitive scientists to care about P4C. It just turns out that they're both drawing from Dewey or very Deweyan friendly sort of perspectives, and the cognitive scientists, at least the ecological psychologists, don't tend to talk about politics. It turns out it's because Gibson was a Marxist and he got slapped on the hand and told not to do that, so then he never talked about it again. So it turns out maybe he cared, but then had to suppress it for his publications or something. But yeah, so the interesting thing about P4C is that it's like a really, really radical sort of maybe approach to content. That's the way I sort of think about it, is that they make philosophy a practice or something that you do, or maybe even something that you play. And they don't care necessarily about mastering every single bit above the text itself. Like they really embrace this idea that it's better to bring everybody on board and to sort of see what everybody gets out of the text rather than to sort of pretend that if I mute all of you and I just talk at you for the remainder of our time, it's sort of where they reject that is better. Even if I've read more of Gibson, I've read more of the P4C literature than some of you. I'm not entirely sure. There are some experts here on pedagogy that I would hate to presume that I know more than they do. But the idea is, even in that case, I'm going to sort of harm the space of interest and learning and the feeling that I'm welcome here, right? So my views, I think, are bringing those two together because the ecological psychologists in the sort of eco-linguists who are definitely drawing directly from their work are sort of rejecting the idea that your brain is a computer at all. I'm okay with some level of, there's obviously some, like I have a dream, what is that? It has to be kind of weirdly computed in some way. Like there's images, like, at least I feel like there are, right? So there's a whole history of neuroscience and a whole history of philosophy of mind So you can't just throw it all out. But it very much incorporates these notions of relationality, these notions of creating a space, or how it is that the spaces around us sort of define how we think or how we feel, and things like that. So it's about like understanding that like maybe thinking is more of a interactive process rather than a sort of individual thing that I do on an armchair by myself. In fact, it's going to take these approaches that there are like individuality is an achievement of groups. Achieving groups is not an achievement of individuals. You are not born an individual thrown into the world by yourself, but rather deeply intermeshed with other people. And you're scaffolding what you know, how you see, and how you think through your interactions. So if you cultivate thinking through a group, you're actually dealing more of what it means to be human than you are if I assign you a paper and you go write it by yourself and you come back. That's a very niche and interesting skill. It's a very powerful thing that some of us can do, but it makes a lot of sense when we struggle with it. Philosophy is very hard in the traditional sense, but it turns out that wonder comes really naturally, asking very deep philosophical questions, right? And there's a lot of really neat evidence of this. Like at least in the anecdotal sense, when you hang out in P4C circles too long, I get really excited because you find like when a child there's a really great example that the P4C Hawaii program does. They're funded through a big program in Japan. They basically wowed a really rich person in Japan by sort of doing this program and showing how it works. And one of the examples is there's a big circle, which you again get in a circle to sort of decentralize the power structure of a classroom. And you have elderly scholars and their like grandchildren and also students all in this circle. And the children have practiced P4C. And this little spirit, this like ball goes around, and whoever has the ball can speak. This is like we're kind of playing against the Moors in Japan of who gets to speak and who has the power. But that's kind of what P4C does. It's very volatile in that way. So this young student gets the little ball and looks up to her grandmother and says, "Why are old people so sad?" Right? Which is like, you can't do that. First of all, no one in Japan talks about emotions. Hierarchies don't receive questions from the little people, especially personal questions. And in fact, this grandmother kind of looked around like, I'm in front of other people. I'm not supposed to say. But she had, passed her the ball and gave her a space. And she kind of tried to talk about some of the world's issues. And by creating that space, that dialogue could happen, which isn't just, wow, like that's great. This is a really, really important thing that may not otherwise come up. But it's about creating a space. And once that space is created, then you end up with this kind of like hunger or interest in learning. So I think that the principles of ecological psychology / these like linguistic tools are the science of what is already being put into practice in these like Deweyan, very embodied, very relational kind of spaces. I just want to bring them together. I think that they help answer. Ecological psychology cares about loans of intelligence. I think by providing these empirical results, we can demonstrate that by thinking about content differently, we can get really amazing results. Does that mean that like I don't think it's a definitive argument to change everything about everything? But I do think it's really exciting, right? At least that's one thing that gives me hope, and maybe it will give you all hope.
Cool. That's really cool and helpful. Thanks.
Yep. I am excited though about Descartes. I included a bunch of slides about Descartes because I'm convinced that I'm going to talk with Hayne and Kristopher specifically about Descartes in the near future. And as a non-dualist, I'm not an anti-Cartesian. I'm an anti-dualist in the sense that if Cartesian dualism is your thing, we're going to disagree. But I study with monists who hate Descartes, and they all just say Descartes' the reason that the environment is destroyed. Is the reason that AI failed. Is the reason you have people like Elon Musk. Everything's his fault. And I'm now at the very end. I'm a 6th year. My dissertation defense will be in like 2 weeks. Right. I'm on like, actually, non-dualism allows you to start reread Descartes and see some of the kind of emotional things he says. The kind of like maybe like paint him more as an actual French philosopher rather than this like totally monolithic, somehow materialist, even though he's really, really religious and really like trying to prove that God exists. And he says some really spicy things that actually turn out to be kind of complex. And there's not like what's the mind-body union? That's kind of fucked with dualism, doesn't it? Interesting. But we're still there. I think it'll be really fun to see if we can take a non-dualist approach to what Descartes says, which sounds awesome to me. Let's do it. Also, apparently there's a manga of Descartes, so I had to include it.
I was wondering if that was like actually manga Descartes or just a manga person who happened to look a lot like Descartes. So
I googled Descartes manga last night. I found that. We're going with it. There was also a villain in Trigun named Descartes, but anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here, and I think it's really interesting. I'd like to talk to you maybe more later also about the P4C stuff. I'm pretty active in that community as well. But I want to, I mean, this is maybe not necessarily even that important, but it's just, I'm fired up about it. So I want to hear more about how you understand Cartesian dualism and your views on the kind of trialism thing. And I mean, we've like interacted a couple of times on Twitter about Descartes and talked about how we're going to do something with it.
Yep.
And so I guess I'm just, yeah, I mean, you know, they're kind of, as you said, like little kind of breadcrumbs. Can you spell out a little bit more some of what you're thinking about, where like the, you know, the brain is not a computer, and how that kind of relates to how you understand dualism?
Yeah. So this is the hardest possible question, because I've had all the good things about Descartes beaten out of me by sort of traditionalists. I failed my first qualifying exam because I tried to say something interesting about Descartes. I had to do another one on Descartes to fix it. So now I'm let's just, it's the mind and the body and they're separate things, and that's it. That's all we need to think about. There's no weird things in the passions that you'd ever consider. Don't look at that. It doesn't exist. That's just weird. The corpuscles, the like very clearly connected space, like, nope, just ignore it. You're basically swimming in reality. Nope. Empty space, Kantianism, something. Yeah. Descartes' the hardest part for me. I want to learn from Cartesians because I think that many people in the cognitivist traditions, my enemies like Jerry Fodor, or these like, we've built entire systems that basically say, I'm just Descartes again, and they're wrong. I think that the easiest way to situate my perspective on the sort of importance of anti-computationalism, so I'm more like mad at Cartesians, and I don't even know, side note, that getting Descartes exactly right matters if we're in the science. Like if we're talking about how it's applied in the lab, like I would love for it to be right, but saying, well, actually Descartes said this, okay, then I'm talking about Cartesians. They didn't say that. Which is fine. I would rather they said it right, and I would love for papers like that to recover Descartes. I love that. I would love a phenomenological recovery of Descartes. That sounds great. But one of the most important things is, while your brain might compute, it isn't computing everything. And if it's not computing everything, the stories we have and the explanations we use for almost everything when we talk about the mind, this sort of like Western philosophical brain that is isolated from its world, constructing meaning, that's very white, it's very cis, it's very Western, and there's a ton of alternatives that you can't see if you think everything comes from here. And you are imbuing so much responsibility on your brain and ignoring so many things. So one thing I learned in cognitive science is almost everything, especially the brain, is a mystery. Action, like juggling or walking, we don't know how it works. We have a pretty cool idea about how things organize and how that organization makes things easier. For example, your bones move in certain ways, so that reduces how much you have to think about where they move. However, if you're consciously or unconsciously like making your leg not fall over all the time, you know how much energy it would require to do that? A lot. And it turns out we don't know how the brain would do that. In fact, our understanding of the brain is so weird that we're just like, blood is in this area. That probably means that color vision is happening because we showed you a green piece of paper outside of a, whereas in reality, if we could somehow measure you when you walked outside and saw a green tree, that wouldn't light up at all. And also light up, it's actually just blood being moved around. We don't even know what that means. We do know that neurons fire in certain ways. We have action potentials. There's plenty of like studies that can show on and off again sort of things. So obviously there are localizations in the brain. There are things in the brain. But the explanation when it says like it's all in the brain, the only thing we're going to scan is the brain. The only thing that matters for philosophy of mind, language, are these like innate concepts, which have little pieces, which we can map onto neurons. That it's like zooming all the way in. And outside here is the world filled with all these other kinds of things that can't even ever glance. And that is that problem is so pervasive that it ends up being, it's sort of like when, to me, I always go back to Zen epistemology, where you have like a Zen master and a bunch of students, and all the students are basically like grad students. They're monks, and they're trying to get enlightenment. They're trying to get it. And they like pose a koan poem or a puzzle, and everybody tries to give an answer. They're like, oh, it must be nothingness. It must be one of these concepts we've been studying. And someone who wasn't kind of paying attention or was like meditating or maybe gets it, walks by and like does like a weird gesture, and the Zen master's like, boom, he gets it, let's go, enlightened, you get it. Or like this person smiles in the face of this weird response, this sort of effective embodied response, demonstrating they're not trying to do everything up in this space. So I view this kind of, if you hyper focus on the brain or even this sort of like neo-Cartesianism, you're going to fundamentally misunderstand what to do. And what I think, at least in terms of the context of this presentation, if you want hope, then there's actually avenues outside of giving a shit about what the like flyer says about, you know, we don't need to tell people the world is on fire. Everybody gets it in some sense. Even if they're delusional, they still like know that things are getting more expensive, and that like some of us are storing bacon in our freezers because maybe pork will be gone in our lifetime or whatever. Like there's just like, that rain was longer. There aren't any more insects. Okay. Or even if you want to use the historical example, oh goodness, indentured servitude, that is a little weird looking. Like you look back, it's not as if anybody was ignorant of the fact that slavery is wrong. Like it's there. It's the information is there, right? But if you just pay attention to what's going on in their brains and you try and inform them, I think that's the wrong approach. There are other interventions, and I think they're empathetic interventions or world-involving interventions. Like you can change the kinds of environments we're in. So it doesn't really help the Descartes situation. I think that recovering Descartes ends up more like we should just read him, which I don't think we are doing. And I would love to do that. And I think that you and Haynes specifically offer contexts in which I can be taught something, because I know that there are spicy things to say, especially at the intersection of phenomenology and Cartesian interpretations. I mean, phenomenology is Cartesian as hell. The fact that there are sort of anti-Cartesians who come out of there, awesome. Let's figure out what that's up to. So I don't know. That sounds like the wrong, super exciting answer, but at least hopefully tied in the 7 things that I'm thinking about that are related.
No, it's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. This is fun. Also, ecolinguistics is really niche and nobody understands it.
So, my question here is, insofar as you appeal to Dewey, specifically Dewey's experiential model of education, one of the things that you seem to be kind of eliding or perhaps haven't fully developed just yet is the role that habit plays in education, specifically insofar as education intends to inculcate into students flexible habits of conduct that can be deployed across different situations, such that the situations can be resolved in a way that enables the growth of the individual. One of the things that I think is missing from your account is the ways that habits vis-a-vis education organize persons into, well, one, persons, right? Personhood being an achievement for Dewey or a social achievement for Dewey. And 2, the specific kinds of habits supplied by a given cultural environment, right? So my tension here is you deploy Dewey correctly in the mode of much of his educational theory, but what you seem to miss is Dewey's firm emphasis on habits, and not simply habits for navigating the worlds, but the ways in which the cultivation of appropriate habits allows for the disclosure of particular kinds of character, particular kinds of personalities among individuals. And so I'd be curious how you would connect that to the account that you're giving. Yeah, for sure. I cut that couple slides about habit out because I already had a 45 slide, 10-minute presentation. And 1/4 of my dissertation is on habits specifically, not about Dewey, although I had to, as a result of feedback from Elena Kafari, add Dewey, it's relevant. I just didn't have the space. I think that's exactly what P4C is doing. Like you're recognizing that learning is actually temporal. I call it like a stabilization. So my approach to habits is sort of Jamesian, or maybe there's even Merleau-Pontian habits, and I sort of bring them together in my dissertation. Dewey probably just would have been the right person instead of those 2 figures. I could have just used Dewey instead, but I got there late, so I'm catching up. So this is I think that what they're doing is actually creating a space for you to explore things in this, using the tools of P4C in particular, and over time, sort of that process of becoming is done in that space. So you create a space that facilitates becoming. That is where those individually sort of obtained but socially mediated habits
like the very Deweyan way. Now they specifically only realized they were Deweyan late. Like they started doing something based on what's the first P4C guy's name? I don't remember his name. But anyway, they didn't realize they were doing Dewey, and it had like scholars of philosophy that they over like students like me had to come in and be like, hold on, I have not that far into Dewey, but this seems pretty relevant. And so now if you start reading P4C literature, they're starting to read Dewey and realize that we can use the language of Dewey that we were already doing. So I think it's sort of, they're applying it maybe. Dewey's at the heart of embodied cognitive science on the inactive side. Ecological psychology is directly more phenomenology slash was it Gestalt psychology, and they're more psychologists in that way. So they actually know they engage with the side of Dewey, but not his school stuff. They engage with his action perception. So they have that the reflex arc paper is one of the canonical texts of ecological psychology. Which, if you're not familiar with it, read it. If you don't understand it, talk to someone about it. But essentially, when you see a fire out in the world, touching the fire is an act of seeing the fire. You don't have to see it, represent fire in your head, touch it, burn, move, right? That the process of this perception into brain, understand, gets to action. But rather, perception and action are a part of the same thing. So when you touch the fire, much like when you explore the visual illusion by moving around, that's an action, but that's also a perception. So there isn't perception, processing, motivate action, engage in action, oh gosh, react, right? In fact, it's perception, action, perception, action, perception, action, perception, action, right? So that's where you have that sort of dynamic interaction. So it's very Deweyan all the way down. And I think that habits is where, that's how I talk about the stability of self, or like where it is that you get stability up and against the sort of ever-changing dynamics. And that's, I don't know, that's, the embodied approaches are all a little bit varied exactly what habits are, but that's kind of what they're doing, right? The sort of becoming. And in linguistics, the sort of languaging is very much the same parallel. I don't think they cite Dewey because they're so far in the, we're just fighting Lakoff and Johnson. They're like, we're fighting the sort of Chomsky world. They don't even get to philosophy. That's sort of our job to try and get them in. But they're very much trying to apply it in that empirical way, where language is this ongoing thing. And then you end up with kind of like, I guess, habits, or like habits of language, or like what you're familiar with. And then you can sort of resonate with people based on that. So I think that like habits are very much part of it. I think it's just not something that I included in particular. Hashtag read Dewey. That's what I'm going to do. And I found people who don't want to read Dewey, and I think they're wrong. Like at least every time I find one, I'm like, man, what do you mean you don't like Dewey? Come on, he's right about everything, or at least he seems to be.
Yeah, you brought up the I don't know much at all about the historical side of this. Now I want to read some Dewey, but so I keep just asking about other things. But I was wondering about the kind of description you gave of the visual illusions, and the way that you put it just now in this exchange was helpful, for at least for like helping me see what I was wondering about, which is, so you've got the visual illusion of where it makes it look like one person is much taller than the other, but it only looks that way to you if you're standing on the X.
Yeah.
And so you're thinking, or according to this like embodied enacted perspective, the idea is like, well, you moving around and breaking out of this kind of very artificial setup that you're in, that's perception too, or like that's part of what perception is. Yep. So you say that like, so when people take that line and say this kind of the touching of the fire is part of perception, the actual action, or moving around is perception. Is it like, is the thought there like, I guess I'm wondering how exactly I should be interpreting that. Is it to say like, look, you can use the word perception to refer to just or something, but that's kind of a just like practically speaking, using the word perception in this way is going to be really misleading or really like blinkering. And so it's like
abstract,
or is it more like, I don't know, like there's literally, I don't know what the alternative would be.
I think a really good way to talk about it is that we tend to parse perception, thought, and action.
Yeah.
And the ecological view says, no, that's not how that works. Living is a wiggling of all kinds. One of my favorite insights from the ecological school, they're the empirical side of the inactive ecological sort of dyad. The inactivists are the philosophers. Is that you are always moving. Even someone who is paralyzed is always moving. If you were not moving, you could not see. So here's a really great example. Your eyes do this. They're wiggling. That allows you to access law-like information to tell you whether something is attached to something. My laptop is not attached to the table, but the table is attached to itself. Based on how light works in it's a three-dimensional space, that gives me a slight bit of information. Now it's constantly like this, but I can recognize that's not, whatever. But then I might see a shadow over there and it's going to be like, oh shit, what is that? It's the shadow. Like, you ever had like the shadow cat joke where, it's a shadow. That's the shadow cat. No, it's just you thinking a shadow over there is a cat because of it temporarily resembles a moving, living thing that is separate from the space, but it's just a shadow or something like that. So it's important once you understand that like perception, thought, and action aren't in the linear order, that you end up in this sort of space. The second thing is, while it is that your brain lights up when you see something, think about something, or try and act, right? Actually, your brain is lighting up all the time, right? It's a constant process, right? And so when you lean into a perceptual component, you're looking, actively searching, you're in the middle of a philosophy presentation, you actively speaking, or you pondering something, you're actively thinking, or maybe dreaming, right? It might shift into a particular kind of action, but there is no inaction, right? Another way that your body is constantly moving is called postural sway. This is something that's happening constantly. Basically, you're never still because your ears are trying to balance you, but that's balance you through constant movement. And that's why when you put yourself on a ship or put yourself in a plane or put yourself in a new space, it augments your understanding of the world. And why it is that when you're on like a skateboard, you lean forward and backward is that it gives you law-like information about your environment. And once you couple to that environment or you connect to it or resonate with it, wow, that looked really cool. Then you don't have to think about it. Like, you don't have to worry about processing it. As it informs you about what you need to do. So when I go to bed, I don't see very well at night. My night vision is horrible. So I take my phone out and I do this. And it provides me surface information just so I can walk around and kind of navigate. Like if there's something out of the ordinary, a cat, for example, which is right here. If you ever see my profile picture, you'll see my cat is on top of me, right? But that's the cat next to me. But I can look for like objects in my environment. I'm just looking for surfaces. So the ecological perspective is that you don't see a field of like objects that you then have to interpret, but rather you see surfaces that are actionable. What those are, what concepts, that's a later process. What you can do with them is what you are engaged with. And that becomes way easier, right, to sort of handle theoretically, right? So that's and it turns out that like those critiques against philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science, even neuroscience, have had such an impact that those theories are starting to bend towards the body. Think about Boston Dynamics. Boston Dynamics robots are stupid as hell, but they're really good at running. That's because humans are really good at running and stupid as hell, right? So they're actually getting something right about organisms. And they can go from there, really good at running, to being really good at opening doors, or really good at shooting people, I guess, which is really scary. But like, you can solve the problem that way, because if you can get a moving organism, you're closer to getting an organism. A chess robot is not human. It doesn't have the more human capabilities than like the dog robot, because the dog robot does more things that humans do than the chess robot. Almost none of us play chess. Almost everybody walks or engages in some sort of locomotion of any kind, right? Or at least engages in embodied movement. Even someone who's paralyzed engages in embodied movement, and their perception of the world depends upon those movements. And if those movements didn't happen, they wouldn't be able to see, or they wouldn't be able to like engage with their world, right, very easily, or it would be deeply, deeply affected. Not because they have a brain problem, but because the sort of interaction between movement and information is super important. That's the weird cognitive science bit. I didn't want to like, when I go to philosophy spaces, it ends up being really spicy because I'm not very precise. Sorry. I'm just sort of like wiggling around and trying to get people to talk to each other. But the cognitive science is really interesting.
It's all, that is for what it, yeah, that is helpful. And like the cognitive science stuff is all really cool. Yeah. So thanks.
I didn't get any D&D questions. I put breadcrumbs of D&D monsters that are relevant for each part of my talk through there.
Yeah, okay. You did. Those are great. I feel like a fraud though, because I haven't played D&D for a while, and I feel slightly disillusioned about D&D. Our group is playing dark now.
No. As a grad student, I almost didn't play for like 6 or 8 years because I was forever DM, and you just can't do both. I finally ended up hiring a DM to play once a month. Imagine paying someone to DM for you infrequently because you can't even believe that you're like, oh, I can't play 3 hours at one time. But what if I should be reading Descartes or something right now? But anyway, I get it. You're not a fraud at all. You wrote really cool things about D&D. You care about D&D. You're a scholar. Use it.
Thank you.
Yep. I actually sent you an email, I think, recently.
I saw it this morning. I don't know how it's possible. It's because I was because Jen asked me to. I was looking into Cognito stuff with Jen, and somehow that's how I found it. But I am interested.
Cool. Yep. That's fun. Yeah, I'm really excited about P4C. We're starting it up in Cincinnati, although like I said, I'm a sixth year, so I'm on the precipice of being thrown into the abyss, which may or may not be a breakfast item if you've seen a particular movie that has just come out. If you haven't, good luck finding out what movie it is. But anyway, I'm at the very edge of my school, so I can't even join in the projects that they're up to. But there is some like really cool stuff happening here, and they just made contact with University of Hawaii and are going to start a program here. And we actually it's kind of getting traction. So if I end up working with them in some way, you'll be hearing from me from a more formal capacity. That's the exciting bit. But I have to meet. My meeting's on Tuesday. You have a meeting on Monday. Well, we have a big week coming up. But yeah, we didn't even get to talk about the Japanese philosophy stuff that I'm up to, but it wasn't relevant for this particular case. I mean, you can't fit that much in 10 to 20 minutes of coffee. It was really fun. Like ask any questions you want. Happy to talk. I don't even know how much time we have left because I'm not paying attention. 9 minutes, I think.
Yeah, we've got 9 minutes. So, if you all there's other questions, there's time for maybe one or two more.
Cool.
It's also fun if we. So this is like gonna bleed straight into the break session in the Reason to Hope room that's 12 to 1 before the colloquium. So
so it's an hour. Cool.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a whole hour in that space.
Sweet.
So if we have there's burning questions, there's time for burning questions. At the same time, we can also I'm sure it's available now to head over. I don't think there's like a talk happening in that same room. Maybe I should.
No idea. But yeah.
There's coffee hour 2 is okay. Maybe never mind.
Cool.
Because there's something going on in that room until noon.
Well, feel free to hang out here. No pressure to do more academic stuff. I know we're a small group, but also we've been here for a while. And then I'll be a backup moderator in the middle of the big colloquium talk, I believe. So I'm a deputy there. I'll be there to fend off. I don't know, critical Dewey questions. I just feel like Flowers would crush those, so it doesn't really matter. But I'll be there to cheer on more Deweyanism. It's interestingly how prominent Dewey is in this little series. It's also quite comparative, or includes non-Western philosophy, considering how rare that is outside. So anyway, that's why I love it here. This is great.
Yeah, so maybe we should thank Jonathan for a very stimulating conversation leading that. Thanks very much. Jen and Cassie aren't here, but thanks to them as well for putting this together yet again.
Yeah,
I can personally attest to how much time Jen at least puts into this. I just see her working on it all the time.
Honestly, it's crazy. I promise, and this is useless in this room, but I am going to do so much more when I'm finished. Once I defend this dissertation, I am very excited to join it. I mean, I helped organize the last one. I brought together one of the panels. I moderate. I do whatever they tell me to do. That's totally cool. But it's the best philosophy community. Let's see it grow. I mean, this is awesome. So yeah, I love it. This is my first. I wanted to really present, even though I'm very weird. So I knew I needed an opportunity to go hide in a little informal space to wiggle about Descartes anime Descartes. But anyway, thanks for hanging out.
More all philosophy conferences should include some anime depictions of what the philosophers that they present. That should just be a standard requirement.
I search them every time I make a PowerPoint, 100% of the time. I found one of Niels Bohr. I actually have it's not a manga, but it's a graphic novel. Super great. Quantum physics in manga, hell yeah, let's go. But also you find random anime characters who took the name of a historical philosopher just because that's how they just like, I don't know, this guy's named Descartes. Yeah, Google Descartes in anime and you'll find the Trigun, like big ogre villain. Odd name choice, but go for
Nice.
it.
So yeah, I guess in a couple minutes at least, you can head on over to the Reason to Hope room.
Perfect.
And then that'll go right into the colloquium, and hopefully I will, well, Jonathan Flowers obviously be there at the colloquium. But
Probably.
all right, so thanks everyone, and yeah, I'll see you there then, I guess.
See ya.
Thanks.
Yeah, I guess we can let this